Welcome. It's our New York roundup panel discussion. New York seems like a very, very long time ago, so the biggest challenge of this is going to be remembering all the great fashion that we saw. But I've got an expert set of panellists who I'm sure will do a brilliant job. If you guys would like to introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Harriet Walker. I'm a fashion journalist and author.
Hi, I'm Tallulah Harlech. I'm an actress and somewhat of a fashion insider, I guess.
Hello, I'm Katie Barron. I'm an author and a journalist writing about fashion, culture and design.
What were our highlights from... Well, actually, we'll start, which is cheeky, because we should talk about New York, but no one likes talking about New York too much, because it's a little bit boring. So we'll start with what were our highlights from the season as a whole, and then I'll shoehorn us into a New York discussion later. You mentioned J.W. Anderson, Tallulah. Do you want to talk about that a little?
Jonathan, darling Jonathan. Well, he's just, to me, I think, because I've gotten to know him over time better and better, and there's something that he, to me, has a very intelligent way of designing, and I think that it's also something that Nicolas Ghesquière has. Lots of different people have it, but Jonathan strikes me as someone, although in London, who definitely has that. When you're looking at something coming down the runway and possibly it looks maybe awkward, and in that way it makes you go, oh my god, I'm not really sure, this is bugging me, do I like it? And then by the end, and it grows on you more and more, you're like, that is great, and that is designing, and that's pushing something and making something difficult happen. And I think that that's the important with a lot of design. And I don't know how much most of New York really cultivates that idea. I see huge amounts of designers, lots who I don't even know. And there's an element that I kind of like, that's a lot of it's quite utilitarian, quite kind of throw on a big blocky jumper and some kind of straight leg pants. It's a sort of, it's what I think Phoebe Philo does better at Celine with more luxurious fabrics, and yet somehow in New York it all becomes just a bit rougher, cheaper, clunkier. There are some times when I think it works really, really well, but for me, New York I do find quite tricky, and I think there are too many designers, and there needs to be a hone-in on talent and a support given to specific people.
I think New York tends to be about more kind of incremental shifts. I mean, obviously it's always been kind of renowned for being the sort of most commercial of the four cities. So it's more about those, the small incremental changes that are going to happen. I mean, there's so many people, kind of designers made comments afterwards talking about going back to their origins, which is okay, but you can only hear that kind of so many times. The one person for me, though, I mean, just as my highlight would probably maybe be a person more than a particular show, would be just Marc Jacobs as this kind of fashion colossus in a way. And what I like about Marc, in a weird way, I mean, it's maybe a little bit wrong to say it, but it's not even so much about, I can't actually even pinpoint maybe a particular look out of all the various collections that he worked on. But just in terms of, I like the fact, I'm thinking about New York particularly, of all the shows, in terms of the sort of scenography, there are very few people that kind of gave us any sort of fashion fantasia, as it were. There was very few people that kind of take you out of that knowledge that you're in New York or you're in this sort of urban jungle. It always seems to be that's a parameter that's been set, that's the way it's going to be displayed, that's how these presentations will go. And I think the Marc Jacobs show for me in New York, where I'm sure we'll talk about it a bit more, but you almost get this kind of weird dark side of suburbia, and he shows the clothes twice, and I think, just touching what Tallulah said about kind of something that has a bit more of an intellectual capacity. I mean, regardless of how that connects to the fashion, for me at least, it's exciting to see someone that's thinking about the presentation and the wider context of how these clothes are being framed. So for me, it's kind of more of a person than a show, if that's okay.
No, that makes sense. Harriet, would you agree that kind of, that I guess that creative, intellectual part of fashion, do you think that is slightly lacking from New York?
It's not what New York is known for. I think what was interesting for me this season was that New York designers are often spoken about, that they're all kind of grouped as super wearable, which is, I don't know whether that's a compliment or not, but that wearability is so based in a sort of New York ideology. So wearability becomes a sort of winter coat with bare legs to be worn in the freezing snow, which to me is not that wearable. But what happened this season, that wearability was actually, I thought, translated quite well. So there were loads of really great coats. There were loads of trousers. There were loads of kind of knits and separates that you were talking about, quite utilitarian. And that actually, it was wearable. It didn't feel like that sort of New York Upper West Side paradigm that is normally presented, I think. So it felt more commercial, if New York can be even more commercial, but it kind of felt more pragmatic as well.
I want to talk a bit about the word wearability, because that's a funny place in fashion where people do see it as some kind of insult. You know, they see it as, especially, I don't know if that's the kind of real London fashion girl in me, but you know, if you say, oh, it's very wearable, it's almost like one of those read between the lines ones.
Like saying, that's nice.
Yeah, exactly. You know. Do you think, but is there a certain thing where it's a good way to start the fashion season by seeing stuff that is about, you know, clothes that will sell and will be worn? Is that, what excites you more? What should fashion be? Should it be wearable? Should it be?
I think it has to sort of sit partially in both camps. You know, it has to be an interesting concept that you can think about and talk about. But you know, if you are a fashion designer, ultimately someone has to be able to buy it and presumably put it on and go somewhere. J.W. Anderson's quite a good case in point, I think, to sort of bestride both of those things. Prada as well. You know, and you go and see shows that do seem, I don't know, terribly extreme or kind of ascetic almost in the way they're presented, something like Rick Owens, but then you take it apart and those pieces are incredibly wearable. They're sort of wardrobe staples almost. So it is possible to do both.
It's the pulling apart that's the big issue, isn't it? That's the way to find that balance. But I think people talked about that with not the recent Saint Laurent show, but the previous one, where people were saying, well, you know, is this going to be totally directional enough? You know, what will happen with this? And I think from what I know, it's been selling quite well because those pieces can because those pieces can be pulled apart and can fit into sort of many different wardrobes as well. You know, it's not a kind of wholesale look, and I think that's probably the only way to achieve wearability, but also that kind of kudos that you need to keep pushing boundaries. So I think, as you said, you know, you were saying with J.W. Anderson, you need to keep pushing those boundaries, or otherwise you're in danger of becoming, you know, in a massively oversaturated market. Where do you go if you don't have some kind of perspective, basically?
I think what's interesting about a lot of the New York designers is that it is very much a sort of proposition for a wardrobe. It does feel quite head to toe, the way it's presented, the way it's styled, and often the way it's worn in real life as well. You get, I think in New York, you get real sort of aficionados of one label. So you get the sort of Alex Wang girl and Philip Lim as well. That label's kind of very much to do with just putting it all on and a kind of head to toe look. And I think that comes through in quite a lot of from this season anyway, the kind of the inspirations that people were talking about. Some of them didn't feel like dress-ups or costumes, but it was very much like, this is my vision, and it was a head-to-toe look.
This is interesting that we kind of talked about. It's really relevant that you brought up Marc Jacobs, and I think that we were talking about J.W. Anderson before, and then we moved into this idea of wearability, because it gets into this issue of, you know, what the show should be about, and perhaps that's something that's less relevant for New York, because apart from Marc Jacobs, as you said, people tend to use the show to put out this, you know, this head-to-toe wardrobe for a woman. But do you think that it's more exciting when designers are starting to sort of reconsider what the purpose of a show is and use it less about, and make it more about, you know, showing a real spectacle and then getting their brand and their sellable stuff across through, whether it's, you know, collaborations or films or something different?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite a tricky tightrope to walk. Actually, there's quite a fine balance, because if you go too far, if you're not really adept at it, then it can become quite gimmicky. But I have to say, from kind of the last couple of days, really looking over the New York shows, you know, I'm so craving a bit more of the kind of the old days of McQueen, where you would get something and you wouldn't just, you know, you'd get the show, but you'd get the entire vision behind the show, that you felt like you had this, you know, access to an entire universe. So you kind of felt like you understood where the whole concept sprang from, you know, which isn't necessarily to do with wearability, but it is about completely understanding, you know, this vision. And there's something, and of course, and it's very thrilling on a more basic level as well. And so I can't pretend that I'm not craving those kinds of experiences and to see things presented in that way. I don't think it's necessarily appropriate for everyone, but there is that thing when, you know, you can see one too many runways where it's literally just, you know, you start to feel like you don't, you know, back in, you know, you're in the 80s or something, everything's just about this kind of monochrome walkway, and for me that feels a bit tired. So I don't think everyone needs to kind of create huge, you know, dramatic spectacle. It's not always appropriate, but I do long for a bit of the McQueen,
bit of drama.
Back,
I sort of feel like that's not terribly modern anymore, though. I could think it's quite an interesting point to make, that a lot of the designers whose shows feel really current and who, you know, you feel that the message they're giving out sits really well with what people want to buy, but also what they're interested in, are people like Christopher Kane and J.W. Anderson, who just it's all pared back.
The clothes.
It's the focus is on the clothes. It's the girls walking often very, very quickly. You don't really get time to see all that much. Medium Kirchhoff as well. That's kind of spectacular in a way, but this season it was just a really quick procession of models. So I don't know whether all the sort of pyrotechnics are necessary. And sometimes I think they can feel a bit dated because it doesn't feel relevant to what fashion is at the moment, maybe.
I think that's what I'm saying about whether you're adept at doing it. I think, you know, you have to be a kind of maybe from the stable of McQueen or Hussein Chalayan or something, but actually because you need to come from a stable where actually the whole concept behind the clothes is kind of quite elaborate in a way, and it's gone through, you know, these stages. If you're just, you know, wanting to talk about showing a collection that's basically about kind of material innovations, actually it's probably better to have something pared back where actually you can see the print, the fabrics, the, you know, whatever. But so I think it's not really relevant for everyone, but I do think, you know, understanding and being able to engage people in that world that you're creating, the world that it's come from, will really help you to sell things afterwards. I think, you know, if you're sitting here as a journalist, sometimes, you know, we can kind of, you know, we're so used to kind of even looking at the shapes and silhouettes, and we've kind of got this whole world of sort of fashion history, you know, I mean, well, maybe not an encyclopedic knowledge, but in theory we should have, you know, all that kind of background knowledge to claim it. Yeah, exactly. We should have this whole kind of lexicon to deal with. But otherwise, there's something really kind of important at times about being able to kind of frame something or set that scene or just put it in context that gives, you know, helps explain it, even if you're, I mean, in really simple terms, I mean, you know, the row showing in a townhouse or something, I mean, that kind of makes sense to them. I totally agree with you that I don't think it's all about the kind of pyrotechnics, and the bigger the show, the better. I mean, you know, I wasn't particularly a fan, for instance, of the Marc Jacobs show where they came in on a steam train. It almost seemed like that was, you know, I mean, it was impressive, but it's only impressive sometimes to the extent that if you have a massive budget, great, that's what you can do, but not everything has to be Disneyland. But I think what I'm saying in a very long-winded way is that there are times when that extra framing is really helpful.
But that was what was so exciting, I think, about Marc Jacobs this season, is it was equally as kind of spellbinding in a way, but it wasn't, you know, it didn't come across as it was just about throwing money at a catwalk, because it was actually a very simple idea. Like it was just a big, huge, like Instagram filter type light. You know, it wasn't anything that was kind of particularly like, it wasn't that Louis Vuitton kind of might. No. What did you guys think of Marc Jacobs?
I really liked it. I thought it's sexy. You know, it is kind of like pass me the kale smoothie and make sure that I hit up every Pilates class I can so that my body is banging for the little tiny like hot pants shorts. Here we go. Little tops. But it's epic, you know. Edie's haircut at the opening was the only person whose hair was actually real, and everybody else wore a wig. And going back to what you guys said before, there are certain people, it's the same as some people buy online religiously, some people go into a shop religiously. Some people buy into the woman that's dictated by the house, like this, and like then what he sort of develops more into what seems like an old, for Louis Vuitton, it seemed like this young girl here, the hair was just a little bit longer for Louis Vuitton, and it was like the older woman who'd grown up from this girl here in this Marc Jacobs show. And I have overheard so many people before, particularly with not the Saint Laurent collection just now, but the season before, where people have said, I am buying into that woman. I want that woman. So there are as many people who make their own choices off the back of not wanting to see a person or have that kind of total vision thrust upon them in the way of an incredible show or in the way of a big presence of dictating a certain type of personality. And people do want pared back, and they want to make their own decision themselves. And in the same turn, there are plenty of people that I've come across and talked to who really like the idea of a fully encapsulated aura and person that comes off the back of pretty much quite a lot of what we're seeing here at Marc Jacobs, and then the other shows like Louis Vuitton and things like that, Chanel, whatever.
But I think also in this show there was you felt that there was a kind of duality of that woman, or duality of vision. I think because it was shown twice, and because I think he played with the lighting so that in the first sort of outing, some of the more sort of spangly, glittery pieces actually looked very sort of dull and flat, and you didn't see quite how heavily embellished they were. So you got what you took away was a very kind of functional, collars, patch pockets, shifts, very clean lines. And then when it came out again, you realised they were sort of covered in sparkly things, in metallics, that there was a bit of a pyjama cut to them. So it's interesting that Marc Jacobs is perhaps saying that it doesn't necessarily have to be one coherent vision, within that you can have several strands. And he's always, I think, told a story with his collections, not through those kind of massive shows and those big spectacles, but certainly in the clothes and in the sort of thread that develops throughout the models walking through.
I think it was really interesting what you were saying, Tallulah, as well, about this idea of, like, on one hand there being you wanting to sort of encapsulate the brand and take that whole woman, and then on the other hand it also being about the key piece, because I thought that line was walked really well with this collection, because some of the looks are just one piece, it's just like a great coat, but then some of the other looks are about, a whole vision, and you could reproduce that on yourself as well, which I thought was a really interesting way of sort of straddling how different types of women like to dress. And I guess that's a very commercial thing in a sense, because for that kind of savvy London shopper who likes to mix her Marc Jacobs with her J.D. Branson, with her Carven or whatever, you can pick and choose. But for certain territories where people are much more inclined to shop the look, there's that option there, which is quite... It got me thinking about shopping patterns, this collection did.
Yeah, and this is where the statement wearability works. And works for whichever vibe that you feel like you want to choose, which is kind of great and smart in that way, and business minded.
Definitely.
Plus it's interesting, isn't it, the kind of idea of going back to what Harriet said about the showing it twice, almost the idea that you have something that feels quite non-intimidating to start off with, before you kind of see the workmanship and the kind of the glitter and the sort of that attached to it. You almost have this sense that it's almost like something about like revealing the secrets of suburbia or something with this collection. So I felt like, you see this kind of army, this legion of women that come out, then you see the second showing of it, and it's all the secrets involved with it. And I think this again it's a great example, as one of my favourite shows from New York for sure, for all kinds of reasons, of that kind of context to show when it works. I mean, obviously he's referencing very clearly the Alofa Eliasson son that was in the we all saw in the Tate, and I think it's those kind of subtle references. That's what I mean about when you can kind of stage a show where there's sometimes just a twist, that the double showing thing is a really smart way. I mean, I think he commented on this idea, saying that it was ostensibly to show a kind of sense of optimism as well, to have that kind of non-intimidating kind of first run, and then you have this optimism that comes out, and it's the kind of the duality, as Harriet said. So I think for me, this is the one that really works.
Who else stood out for us? I'd like to ask a little bit about Alexander Wang, because we mentioned that before. I thought it was really interesting some of the comments you were making, Harriet, about the way that women dress, and this idea of having a head-to-toe look, and some of the great coats that we've seen. He is one of those New York people. What did you guys think of this show?
I liked it a lot. I think there was a lot of weight put on it because of the fact he was then going to go to Paris and nobody knew what he was going to do there. But I think in the past few seasons, or possibly to go back a bit further, when he started, he really embodied that sort of New York wearability, didn't he? Because a lot of people accused him, rightly or wrongly, of sort of basically being a glorified stylist at the beginning, because it was the T-shirts and the denim and the jackets, and it looked fantastic, but it was very much based on a collection, or the collection was based on how a certain woman would want to look. There's nothing wrong with that, because it sells, and it is how people want to look, it's how they want to dress. But I think he's really moved it on from that. He's definitely now a designer, if that was ever in doubt, and this collection really saw to it, I think, because I think the shapes are incredibly interesting. You can tell, you can see his sort of signatures in the sort of the fact that it is quite minimal, the fact that it's all quite sort of plain or flat, but he's added that sort of luxury, and it doesn't feel, I was sort of saying before, it doesn't feel like that slightly ridiculous New York luxury. It feels like luxury that's part of every day, that's also slightly downtrodden almost, because of the muted palette and because of the fact it's just quite understated, and I really like that about it.
Were you as equally impressed by Alex Wang?
Yeah, I mean, I really liked it. I mean, I could really, it's one of those things, rightly or wrongly, that I could definitely see myself in lots of it, which I suppose is the point at times. But I mean, I thought in terms of the kind of, fetishizing, the sports luxe thing, I thought it did that really, really well without, there was nothing, it didn't feel, I think with the kind of sports luxe thing, it become quite hackneyed quite quickly, and I
Quite
actually
gimmicky.
think, you know, possibly with the way that he'd introduced the various materials innovations with this collection, it felt like everything had just been kind of considered to exactly the right point. I mean, it felt like there was massive expertise here. I mean, for someone that's 29 or something, it was pretty astonishing. I mean, you know, elevating streetwear. This for me was a kind of proper hybrid between that sort of New York luxury and the kind of elevation streetwear that he's known for.
Yeah.
Who else impressed you from the season?
I don't know whether it's cool to say, but I Donna Karan.
Really? Talk to me about Donna Karan.
I just thought the concept behind it was something very interesting. You know, Katie mentioned earlier about designers going back to their origins, and you hear that all the time, and it's sort of, I think, as a journalist anyway, it makes your heart sink because you just think, well, it's an excuse because you didn't have any other ideas. But with this, it was quite clear what she had done, and it was, I think, about time she did it, really. She has a core customer that she doesn't really need to play to that strongly because they love her and they will buy into it consistently, and their daughters will eventually as well. But the idea behind this collection was going back to the mid-80s concept that really launched her, which was the 7 easy pieces, and it was building a sort of interchangeable set of clothing that you could have in your wardrobe, and it would cover every single occasion. It would take you to work, to a dinner, to the school run, you know, everything. All in very simple jersey and all terribly easy to throw on. And that's, for me, is the best side of New York, I think, because, as I was saying before, is the designers there are quite pragmatic, but they're about kind of feminine elegance. But they're also about making the female existence a bit easier in terms of making it glamorous, but also realistic. And I think she does that incredibly well.
I never thought we'd talk about Donna Karan.
I'm really sorry about
that. No, that's good. It's good.
No, I'm glad that we have. I'm glad that we've got it up on screen, and looking at it again and hearing your explanation in that way is...
Yeah, it's interesting because because personally it's not my cup of tea, but I agree with Harriet that, you know, if you're talking about someone going back to their roots, then you might as well go back to the roots of something that you genuinely owned. And that's the thing. The thing is here, she genuinely did pioneer, and she did own, and she did change. You know, this sort of mid-80s references. It does make sense. So you kind of feel like she's totally warranted to do so. Whereas when you've got some designers kind of saying, well, I went back and looked at the heritage of this, and I decided coats is what it was all about. It's like, you don't, but did this designer really? Obviously I'm not mentioning any names. Did that designer really own coats? I don't think so, but when we're talking about these kind of, the lycra sort of body canon, I think this for me, it felt like, well, fair enough, you know, so.
Yeah.
This raises a really interesting point, which is the kind of idea of, you know, like fashion shelf life and how we fetishize certain people as being really exciting. And there is this sense, you know, people don't, if you say Donna Karan, no one goes, oh, that was really revolutionary, but you know, it was, and she really owned sort of what she did.
Absolutely.
But there is this sense, you know, that like we're guilty of it when we do the panels, because everyone we completely agree on who we're going to cover that season with a panel, and it's really natural, and you just, these designers that emerge in your head as the ones that are interesting and the ones that are not, and I guess how we split that is actually quite,
it's kind of arbitrary.
Yeah, it is completely arbitrary.
But what's interesting about it is that in New York, more so recently, I think, because you get the impression, you know, the kind of, the feel of London is that it's full of very young, very exciting, very talented people, and it is. And also, and in Paris, you know, you have a lot of very forward-thinking, interesting, conceptual minds. And New York, I feel, has been sort of pushed towards saying, oh, well, we do that too. Which they do, you know, people like Rodarte and Alexander Wang as well. But I don't think that's their absolute sort of basis or solid ground for what they do in New York. And actually you have people like Donna Karan, who I think has provided clothing for thousands of women since she started, that you know, that they will grow old in and that they will feel comfortable in for the rest of their lives. And I think that's just as important. And it might not be to everyone's taste, it might not be particularly interesting or out there. But again, people like Diane von Furstenberg, I think New York is built on a raft of quite old school female designers, Carolina Herrera even, that people do go back to and they do wear, and they build these sort of fan groups or fan bases, and you can't discount that, because New York, I don't think, is a fashion city in the same way that the other ones are.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I thought was quite interesting overall about New York this season, the thing that I thought worked quite well was there seemed to me to be a definite sense of kind of that businesswoman kind of business glamazon in a sense, and I feel like if you're going to do that in any city, that's the city you can own that kind of looking, you know, whether it's a kind of you know, slightly masculine tailoring, or it's the kind of, you know, even the Calvin Klein collection, everything felt like it had a certain kind of authority and a power to it, and that kind of strength, that kind of female strength, whether it was from the male designers or the female designers. You know, New York is the right place to do that, and I quite enjoyed, I think, you know, it kind of made me smile just looking at a lot of the shows, feeling like you had, these kind of back to the days of the 80s when people strutting down the catwalk, and it was about, there was definitely that sense of, you know, complete antithesis of sort of submissive, floaty fashion. It was strong. I mean, I know obviously it's winter, so to a certain extent it's a bit like, well, that's, you know, by proxy that will happen. But it felt powerful, and I think, personally, I mean, I enjoyed that,
I enjoyed that. I loved that there's a new kind of empowerment woman. There's a place for a stunning dress. There's a moment for, hopefully, at an Oscars ceremony, I'll probably wear Marchesa. But there's such a day-to-day element of this strong woman that's come from... There was an element that I felt in the last few seasons where everyone was becoming quite like an android. I remember Mum and I discussing it, and Mum's like, everybody is an android. But it's kind of true, and women are...
That was uncanny, by the way. I felt like she was with us.
Don't panic, I've got loads of those. And it really is these women who have their kind of epic bag with, you know, their gym kit and their protein shake and their children's something or other that they've got to go to, and they're ballsy, strong women who are going about their life day to day, and New York weather, you know, is harsh and blustery and cold, and it's grimy and it's dirty, and that comes off in a lot of the collections, and I'm into that vibe. I think that's cool, and that's what, for me, I see a lot of young women now wanting to embody, and that real strength of self and a workmanship into their massive working life.
It's really interesting you mentioned workmanship, because that's something that came out of a lot of the panels, and actually particularly when we looked at the Proenza collection and this idea of people wanting clothing with substance. So we talked a lot about why, you know, texture was kind of the new print perhaps, and there is something to do, you know, if you buy something that is textured, it feels like it's got more substance, it's got more meat to it, there's something that feels more, I don't know, it feels more worthy of your money, I guess, and of your sort of investment. I don't know if you guys sort of agree with that, if you've noticed.
I think I prefer texture to print. Print is beautiful and it has its own moment and it's epic in itself, but texture can be overlaid and worn again and changed and sort of restyled by yourself, or has, I feel, a life that is more day-to-day and useful in that sense than beautiful print is so obvious to the eye. And although I don't take away from lots of people who do print beautifully, it's so strong in the colours and in the way that it is. It's like, oh, okay, we've done that look now. And that I get sad about.
I think print definitely has a lifespan, and I think people have been, you know, forecasting the death of print for a long time. I don't think it will ever really die, will it? But it's interesting to see that designers like Jonathan Saunders have sort of moved away from it recently.
And even America Transi, you know, a lot was made of the fact she...
well, she still essentially had print.
Yeah,
so
it was all... everyone made such a hue and cry that she...
I didn't.
You're like, no.
It's still got prints on it. But so maybe texture is the sort of new version of doing that. But I thought texture was used quite interestingly in New York, because it was a way of... at the same time glamorizing but also taking things down a notch, like in Proenza. So it was the sort of, I think there was a bit of chainmail on a kind of incredible couture cut dress, which made it that bit more modern, a bit more punky as well. And I don't know, I think it feels right for now, but when things do feel like that, I don't know how long they last.
Well, it feeds into the wearability thing as well, doesn't it? You know, if you feel like you have certain items that commercially you need to do to sell, and the next way to improve them basically is to innovate with your materials. And I think that's the difference between print and the kind of textiles that we're talking about, is that print doesn't inherently, to the consumer, I wouldn't imagine, feel like an innovation. Even if you can do something amazing, it still feels like a it's an artistic innovation, but it doesn't necessarily feel like a material innovation, something that's worthy of your money or that kind of move on. So I think, you can keep that wearability, you can keep that sort of, the power, but you do something with materials, and that helps. I mean, if you look at the, Victoria Beckham collection, obviously that's the huge jump for her, that she's, and the fact that she's become, she's added in these kind of quite surprisingly more masculine silhouettes to it as well. But yeah, I think, going back into the power, the sort of business glamourism thing we were talking about, that feeds into the wearability thing as well. And if you want to make your collections wearable, but you still want to excite people, that's what you realistically have to feed into, because that is, as Tallulah was saying, that is real life. That's how you make this kind of exciting, the idea that you could literally put that on and step straight off the catwalk in it, but,
I hesitate to mention her name because I realise she's not a great theme of New York Fashion Week, but in terms of powerful women wearing things, Michelle Obama wears, a lot of American designers, and most of the people who show at New York Fashion Week have probably, been about her person at some point. And you get the impression that those designers that she has worn have been helped by that, but also that she has, maybe the notion of her potentially picking something up and putting it on has modernised the shows as well slightly, made them maybe feel more international, maybe slightly more practical, less Upper East Side, and more sort of open to any customer, really.
I'm interested when you say that more international, more open, because I think that's something that was a real takeaway for this season. Definitely. Completely. What did you guys think of Victoria Beckham? Did you find when you were at the Indie, is that someone that people were intrigued by? What was the kind of...
It was difficult. I mean, our news desk was always intrigued by her because it's just always nice to have a picture of her in the picture desk.
Love it.
Exactly. I think what she's doing is interesting. I think for me the major jump that Katie was talking about is simply that she's not a pop star anymore, because it's just, how would you have ever predicted this? For me it still feels slightly bizarre. I like the clothes very much, but they feel like clothes. I mean, I don't sort of sense that there's any great vision. I think she's even said, she thinks about what she would want to wear, and then she does it. What I think, people were sort of really surprised or taken aback by this season is that it was all mid-length skirts, and she does, she wears a lot of short things. That's not surprising to me, because what she's done with this collection in the past is, I think, quite carefully pinpoint what people want to look like, and then she's just done it. And that's not a criticism at all. That's very, very canny. So. But clothes, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Harriet. I think it feels like a sort of very autobiographical collection, essentially, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's, I'm thinking even back to sort of Kate Moss with Topshop. I mean, this works sometimes, and obviously she wasn't fully designing it, but it works because there comes a sort of, this is the evolution you're seeing every season is you get the impression it's the evolution of how she's progressing, and these things are becoming more sophisticated, and the fact that, going back to the masculine tailoring, you would have totally associated her with the kind of the bodycon dresses, even though they were a bit of a longer length last time, with the kind of straps over them, and that still felt like Victoria Beckham. All of a sudden you feel like the more she's becoming immersed in the fashion industry and finding her feet as a designer, this is what she will wear this season. So it's probably not kind of huge vision or sort of great leaps with it. But this is how you're seeing her on the catwalk.
Isn't it? It's just there's a bit more of this look that we've got on the left, the sort of fawny one. That was the one that really stood out for me, because you wouldn't have known.
Oh, panel loved that one as well.
Really,
it's so weird when
that's quite interesting. I mean that's
stand out.
It seems to stand for what she was saying in the collection as well. That it was separates. She normally does dresses. It's she was doing all that sort of really bold neon orange, I think last season, or maybe the one before.
Yeah, it was last season.
Yeah, and it's this quite muted thing that's happened, but in that there are shades of Marc Jacobs and there are shades of Donna Karan. I've said it again. But that again, that's not a bad thing. That's my new secret job. That's it.
Donna Karan. It's all come out now. But I do think she's such an interesting one, because it's funny that you mentioned how she feels like she's learning on, you said like the more she's immersed in fashion, the more that it's kind of being reflected in her collection, because I feel like there's a real, like, to me, it sounds a bit bizarre, but like she feels like the New York version of the young London designers, the one that everyone gets behind and everyone's like, oh, we really want, like, how we all talk about someone like Simone Rocha and everyone loves it and they're like, oh, she's really great, we just want her to do well. And I kind of feel like, bizarrely, because she's come at it with the biggest leg up she could have had, there's a kind of ambience of that towards her coming from New York, where people, they want her to do well. I think there's quite, which is really different to when she started, when people were incredibly dismissive, whereas now, I don't know, perhaps I'm...
But that's quite New Yorky, isn't it? And I think I was reading a piece a couple of weeks ago that was saying, a lot of the New York designers that do well, not just at Fashion Week, but sort of within the fashion bubble in America are Michael Kors, Zach Post and Victoria Beckham, and that's because two of them have been on Project Runway and one of them used to be a pop star. So I think there is there's a Kors celeb maybe. I don't know how well founded that is, given that, at the same time you have the CFDA trying to sort of promote new talent, but the spotlight is shifted onto Victoria Beckham every time. I'm not saying she's not worthy of the attention, but it seems to me it's quite a difficult balance to strike between celebrity and just a person that you want to sort of promote.
Yeah.
I think it's because she's engaging with the right people, and she, to me, her collections always look like she's trying. Maybe she's just trying for herself, and maybe she's just working on draping herself in new fabrics, and what she thinks that she's going to progress in the way that she dresses, as her collections are all kind of for her. But that can be said for Donna Karan, that can be said for Diane Furstenberg, that can be said for all those women who've done those great things and are staples of New York in that way. And she definitely has a wonderful team around her, and also has great relationships with the powers that be within the industry. And I think that there's a sense of humility that she's gone about with asking for help from people and asking for guidance from people, and maybe it's not super directional, but I think that people really appreciate her testament to trying and her effort, and I'm sure she sits down with, I don't know who, but big people, and goes, what do you think? And do you think I'm on the right lines here? And I reckon they like that.
She has a vanguard of, I think the shoes in this collection and last season are Manolo, aren't they? So he's involved. Were there Stephen Jones hats?
Stephen does the hats.
Yeah. So she clearly, those are good people to have won over.
And he says she's a dream to work with.
And I'm sure, and they don't work with just anyone. So there clearly is a kind of industry support network for her, whether she needs it or not. But I think also, again, it just comes down to the fact that she's really good at picking out what people want to look like. Every season she manages it, and it feels like an evolution. It doesn't feel forced.
I think there's perhaps that level of surprise as well, because as we've all said, we're probably quite surprised to be sitting here talking about this in one of our kind of top 5 or top 6 collections that we think are worthy of talking about. So there's that, we can't, now it's inextricable, Victoria Beckham, the pop star, the sort of super famous celebrity icon, and the designer, we can't pretend that we don't know about her background. So I think ultimately there's that, you look at it, you think, I someone that, a friend of mine last night that knows nothing really about the fashion industry at all, just said, I think it's pretty good for Victoria Beckham. And I think that's partly at the crux of this, that people are really, applaud the fact that it's not what we were expecting, and that she's still there, and the collections do seem to be kind of moving on, and that's impressive on one level for sure, I think. I was really interested, I don't know if you'd heard the quote where she'd said, in terms of the skirt length we were talking about, saying that what she generally does is that she thinks about how she would normally wear it, and then she does the opposite thing. So she was saying, normally, and referring obviously that she's a above the knee kind of girl, and that's why she did that. Although, how true that is, I don't know, because she clearly, you see her the minute the show's gone out wearing everything, and then for the rest of the season. So clearly, to me, this is definitely her own wardrobe, and again, nothing wrong with that at all. Plenty of designers work on that kind of basis. But
let's spend a moment talking about the sort of the young designers working in New York, because it doesn't feel to me, which is perhaps really unfair, because there are funding sort of mechanisms put in place, but it doesn't feel like New York is ever about the kind of fresh young talent. You get one every few years that kind of explodes, and often it feels because they've had it's because of their business savvy or a financial leg up in some way, that you feel like everyone's talked about Jason Wu and Alexander Wang, and I think for them I think they're both incredible designers, but it's that real sort of commercial savvy that got them where they are. Why do you think there isn't that same kind of, because they've got Parsons, why isn't there that same...
But Parsons is so different from somewhere like St Martin's, because the point of Parsons is to come out and go and work in a design studio on 7th Avenue and work for a brand and get your sort of training and your knowledge and do all of that for several years, decades even, and then maybe go off and do your own thing. But probably after working in sort of 3 or 4 different places, that's what all the sort of doyens of New York have done. And it's really quite old school, but it's maybe not a bad idea when times are a bit rough to sort of decide, right, I won't start off on my own immediately. That's not for me, I need the experience. But that might be why there is a sort of scarceness.
Do you think it's the schedule as well? Because it sounds really pragmatic, but also like, people fly out for a few days, and in London everyone moans about the schedule, but in a way it's great because it does mean that everyone's there for the full amount of time. Everyone makes an effort to see as much as possible. But with New York, if you're, I don't want to be too harsh, but if you're sat on certain days, you know that people are going to pick a flight for the next day because there's something better on, and it's a strange sort of setup for that. I feel like a lot of great talent just gets a bit overlooked, but then that's the tough business of fashion.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? And I think people have sort of tried working around that inversely, people like Preen and Jonathan Saunders going from London to New York to be sort of taken more seriously. Maybe the answer is for young New York designers to try and come here to be part of a sort of environment that fosters young talent rather than one that sort of looks purely at a business angle. I don't know.
That's interesting. Let's talk about Oscar de la Renta. What did you guys think of this? Because obviously this was a really interesting sort of setup here because it was John Galliano's 3-week residency internship. His internship. What did you guys think of the collection, of the internship, of whatever aspect of this story? It's a big question.
I don't want to be cynical about it. There are pieces in this collection that are really beautiful, but I don't know why I have in my head that maybe Oscar needed a little boost because he's just opened a store over here. I think just before Christmas maybe. And even though he's one of the sort of American canon of fashion designers, I'm not taking anything away from him, his name is known all over the world, and he sells well because he has this sort of coterie of admirers. But he's not headline grabbing. There hasn't been a sort of story about him for a long time. I think there was a huge profile in the New York Times of him maybe about 6 months ago, which was fascinating, but it didn't sort of say anything new. It was behind the scenes at the atelier, and that kind of stuff is really interesting to sort of industry people, to insiders, to real fashion fans. But this Galliano was a story. He was in Womenswear Daily, he was on sort of front pages, there were blogs, and that's possibly the first time for him in a good number of years that he's kind of made news. So perhaps that was part of it. Perhaps he wanted to be sort of reinvigorated and a fresh pair of eyes, but there are lots of eyes in the fashion industry that have a lot less attached to them than John Galliano, so I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the last time I can remember Oscar de la Renta being in the major headlines was talking about when he was one of the first designers to use sort of Facebook commerce, started selling bangles that were straight from the runway, and he was the first person, it hasn't really taken off F-commerce at all, but he was involved in that. And again, so I think there's a big PR machine at work there. I find it quite hard to comment on this collection in a way, mostly just because I'm struggling to find a cohesive message to talk about. I think with some of the other designers, whether you like them or you don't like them, we've all been able to pinpoint something very specific that we see as the perspective, whereas with this collection, I don't have anything sort of negative to say, but I don't have a particular, there's not kind of one vision that I see to comment on massively.
No, I feel like a couple of actresses are going to wear, some of the dresses at some awards. Some great magazines are going to shoot out some of the stuff, probably get a cover or two out of it because Oscar de la Renta is legendary and wonderful. But John is supreme, absolutely. And as of yet, he has not had a refreshed moment in which to totally get involved and get back wholly into designing it. And I can't wait until that does happen because he's one of, I think he's one of the people that I remember seeing at the show when I was 14 or 15 and didn't really understand that much about fashion. I was so moved by it, it made me cry. And I think that he's beyond impressive and completely talented, and obviously when I hear Mum talk about him, it's quite magical. I don't think that there was a whole huge amount that he was necessarily up to or within this, to me. Maybe
you don't feel the presence, do you?
No.
Until you get the sort of gowns, at the end.
Yeah.
There's a sort of whisper of, oh, maybe he was behind the scenes. But I mean, I don't know. Actually, maybe that's a bit of a Dior bar jacket there, but it doesn't scream Galliano to me. And you sort of think, well, what's the point in having someone that illustrious helping you out?
Right, and I'm waiting for that to happen.
Exactly. You know, where the results aren't evident enough.
But that feeds kind of into what you were saying about kind of the purpose of this, and I think as much as for Oscar this was a great thing to do, it's a brilliant PR thing as well for John Galliano to do.
It's rehabilitation, I guess.
And it looks
of his
humble
name
as well.
Yeah, and I'm not against that at all. Like Tallulah says, it would be great to sort of have him back and doing things. It would be incredibly exciting. And I think that's kind of what most of the industry wants as well.
I guess maybe it's just a case of, this is what you will achieve with a sort of short burst, and so it's a taster, because I think the thing is with this, there are some great pieces in here, but it's all about, that's the thing, it's about the pieces rather than the collection. And with most of the other collections we've been talking about the overall message of those collections, whereas with this, exactly as you're saying, we will definitely be seeing these pieces, we're going to be seeing along their carpets, and they'll be kind of great in editorial, there'll be some amazing pieces
especially
there,
those gowns that we had at the
but
that's sort of regardless of Galliano being there or not.
Yeah, I think so.
Oscar de la Renta always has that kind of presence in editorial. He's always American Vogue. He's always in there.
Absolutely.
He doesn't really need to do anything to get in there or not get in there. So it's interesting that he sort of had this pair of helping hands.
I think they're just being it's very delicate, and in a way no one wants to say or do too much, and it's just treading the water and really testing how is this going to fare with the industry, and is everyone okay, and how much do we really say,
perhaps it feels more genuine for that as well, so that it isn't just, the message isn't sort of, all is forgiven, he's back now, we've forgotten what happened.
Right.
Maybe by doing it more gently it feels slightly less Zoolander.
So what's the takeaway from this season going to be? Is there anyone who we've overlooked? Is there going to be, what's going to be the lasting legacy of New York Autumn/Winter 13?
Nice big coat, I think.
Yeah, bit of masculine tailoring, bit of some power trousers. I think
something a bit 80s in places as well.
Yeah, something a bit
which no one else has gone near, really.
That kind of working girl sort of vibe. I think there's a taste for that.
Grand. We could clap, but I think it's weird to clap a season, but I really want to eat one of the millionaire shortbreads. And it also sounds like we're under siege. So thank you very much for being a wonderful New York roundup panel. Brilliant. Thanks, guys.